President George W. Bush, sworn in to lead a divided nation, the pomp, the pageantry, the parties, and the protests. Second terms, the hopes and pitfalls presidents face the second time around. Why is it so hard to get things done when you've been given 4 more years? And back into battle, the Army's 3rd Infantry Division heading back to Iraq for a second tour of duty.
This is NBC Nightly News with Brian Williams, reporting tonight from Washington.
Good evening. The president's second term is now underway on a cold winter day here in Washington with snow on the ground and the sound of cannon fire in the air. George W. Bush entered an even more exclusive club. He is now one of just 16 men to have been inaugurated twice. The message he delivered to a worldwide audience was a call for liberty and freedom. But today, the voices of protest could also be heard. A reminder of the divided nation this president must now govern. That part begins tomorrow. Tonight, however, is reserved, as it always is, for celebration. We have complete coverage tonight of the events of this day, and we begin tonight with NBC's David Gregory at the White House.
Up early on the first day of his second term, the Bushes leave the White House before 9 a.m., joining family, friends, and close advisors in prayer at nearby St. John's Episcopal Church. On a clear but bitter cold Washington morning, the president's motorcade moves toward the Capitol, where former presidents, cabinet secretaries, even a defeated political foe join the throngs who gathered on the Capitol's West Front to behold one of America's most important rituals.
Ladies and gentlemen, the President of the United States, George Walker Bush.
A relaxed, visibly confident president at his second inaugural greets his father, who failed to achieve that honor. With his hand on a family Bible,
I, George Walker Bush.
The president is administered the oath of office by an ailing Chief Justice William Rehnquist.
Preserve, protect, and defend.
Preserve, protect, and defend.
The Constitution of the United States.
The Constitution of the United States.
The president's address reflects on the dangers of a post-9/11 world.
For as long as whole regions of the world simmer in resentment and tyranny, violence will gather and multiply in destructive power.
Mr. Bush speaks of kindling the fire of freedom in the Middle East as the best weapon against terror, but never once mentions Iraq, where the war he chose to fight rages on and divides the country he leads. 10 days before the Iraqi elections, he asks for patience.
Our country has accepted obligations that are difficult to fulfill and would be dishonorable to abandon.
At the same time, the president appears to encourage other democratic reformers in places like Iran to keep up the fight against tyranny.
When you stand for your liberty, we will stand with you.
At home, Mr. Bush begins to outline his goal of overhauling major entitlement programs like Social Security. And he speaks of politics.
We have known divisions which must be healed to move forward in great purposes. And I will strive in good faith to heal them.
But some wounds are still fresh. Isolated protests on the Mall disrupt the president's speech. After a luncheon at the Capitol, a portrait of America's leadership. And then a parade from the Capitol to the White House. The president's limousine inches along under the watchful eye of the Secret Service. Amid the cheers, protest. Some yell, others turn their backs on the motorcade, which is forced at one point to speed up when objects are thrown. Along the final blocks, the president and Mrs. Bush get out and walk, acknowledging supporters and absorbing this uniquely American ceremony. Tonight, the party's 9 inaugural balls before this second term begins in earnest, and this president faces the challenge of implementing the vision he laid before the country today. Brian?
David Gregory at the White House for us tonight. David, thanks. Not all in Congress shared the joy of this day. The top Democrat in the House said today, "Personally, I don't feel much like celebrating." Nancy Pelosi went on to say, "So I'm going to mark the occasion by pledging to do everything in my power to fight the extremist Republicans' destructive agenda." With that, with us now, as he was during our day-long coverage, NBC News Washington Bureau Chief and moderator Meet the Press, Tim Russert. Tim, your initial feelings after the speech?
Brian, I think it was a well-crafted, well-delivered speech. People, I believe, want to let a president have his day of celebration on Inauguration Day, whether Democrat or Republican. I do think where the challenge will be for President Bush is that when he laid out this Bush doctrine of encouraging freedom around the world, how do you apply that doctrine? Do you apply it in Iran, in North Korea, in Cuba? And how does the application differ from what we've done in Iraq? Those details are central to what will happen, I think, to the Bush and the president in his second term. I
know you came with some new polling data we have out today, including how Americans view him coming into his second swearing in.
Here we are, Brian. 50% of Americans give the president a favorable rating. 44% disapprove. That's the lowest a president has had going into a second term since Richard Nixon. So the president has very much a divided country.
What I find the most astounding in your set of numbers, a question about was the removal of Saddam worth it in the end?
It's so important to the country and to this presidency. Only 40% of Americans believe the removal of Saddam was worth it. 52% say it's not worth it. Amongst independents, 56% say not worth it. Iraq hovers over George W. Bush's term, and I think will have a profound effect on what he can do and not do.
I know you have some others, the mandate, whether or not it was.
And take an issue like Social Security. Only a handful of Americans, 33%, a third, believe the president has a mandate on Social Security. And you can see 56% say he does not have a mandate. By 50 to 40, they're against the private accounts concept. The president has a big job to do to sell his Social Security plan. And lastly, Brian, the Democrats. What role do they play? This is interesting. People believe, only 1 out of 3 believe, that the Democrats should basically adopt what the president puts forward. 57% say, no, we need to provide balance. That's the role of the loyal opposition. Even a third of the Republicans say, don't be a rubber stamp, don't be an obstructionist, provide balance. I think the Republicans learned from 1994 when Newt Gingrich rolled in with the Republican Revolution that if you go a little bit too far, the voters will come back and say, wait a minute, we have to realign this political situation, and the president has to be very, very careful not to overplay his mandate.
Tim, thanks. Great to be with you all day today.
Great day.
As we saw a bit earlier, there were protests today here at the event on the Hill and around the nation. Some protesters who were fenced in near the parade route broke down a section of the fence. They scuffled with D.C. police, were finally pepper sprayed. No one there was seriously hurt. In Atlanta, a crowd carrying signs protesting the war in Iraq and the president gathered, but peacefully. And a similar scene in Seattle, where protesters walked the streets for what they called a no business as usual day there. The swearing-in itself today carried added emotion because of the health of Chief Justice William Rehnquist. It is the first time he's been seen publicly since cancer surgery in October, and he's been undergoing aggressive treatment since then. His physical condition and speculation about his possible retirement have fueled talk about what may be a major legacy of the Bush presidency, a possible reshaping of the Supreme Court. Here with that, NBC News Justice correspondent Pete Williams.
The Chief Justice looks somewhat frail, but obviously pleased and proud to keep his inaugural commitment. Breaking with tradition, inaugural planners allowed him to arrive last. He walked aided only by a cane, a new addition. Without consulting notes, he spoke in a noticeably husky voice.
Will you raise your right hand, Mr. President, and repeat after me? I, George Walker Bush.
His face was thinner. He still had a tube from his throat surgery, and he left shortly after the oath, while his colleagues from the court stayed behind. But Dr. Kenneth Berman, a thyroid cancer specialist, called it an impressive performance.
I thought the Chief Justice looked relatively good and gave us some encouragement about his potential response to the tumor.
While medical experts said it told little about his overall health, despite the obvious change since Rehnquist was last seen in public, for the president it was full of meaning.
I want you to know how touched I was that Chief Justice came to administer the oath. That was an incredibly moving part of the ceremony.
It didn't shed much light on his future prospects, but it was a milestone for William Rehnquist, who turned 80 in October and just 2 weeks ago began his 34th year on the court. Pete Williams, NBC News, Washington.
As of noon today, George W. Bush now embarks on one of the most dangerous tasks in all of American politics, a second term in the White House. Most have been disastrous for the president in office. The current president believes he is out to change all that. NBC's Campbell Brown tonight on the challenges ahead.
An inaugural moment unique to this president, the son who achieved what his father couldn't, 4 more years. President Bush was reelected with just 51% of the vote and is claiming a mandate and promising to push through a bold agenda.
I earned capital in the campaign, political capital, and now I intend to spend it.
But history hasn't been kind to second-term presidents. Richard Nixon had Watergate. For Ronald Reagan, the Iran-Contra scandal. Bill Clinton, impeachment. Clinton's chief of staff says there is a common thread.
Part of it is this arrogance that sets in when you've won a national election and you have a feeling that you've got kind of this broad license to do anything that you want to do.
So what are President Bush's prospects for a scandal-free legacy-building second term? He starts with an advantage no re-elected president has had since Franklin Roosevelt. His party in control of both houses of Congress. He'll need that advantage given his big plans, partially privatizing Social Security, simplifying the tax code, and putting strict limits on lawsuits. Political analyst Stephen Hess.
They're massively ambitious, which is quite fascinating because, in a sense, what would have been said sunk his father's presidency was the lack of vision. Now suddenly we have a president with vision up the gazoo.
Implementing the vision is the challenge. Many Republicans are asserting their independence, openly critical of the president's plan for Social Security. Many of the most experienced members of his staff and cabinet are out, now being replaced by a new team just learning the ropes in their jobs. And the shadow that looms over his presidency and will most likely define his legacy, the future of Iraq. Ken Duberstein was Ronald Reagan's chief of staff.
There has to be a way out of Iraq where we can declare victory and define victory in a way that we can achieve it.
Does that have to happen before his second term is up?
For the history books, I think it does.
A war overseas, its outcome still uncertain, that could trump all else he tries to do in the next 4 years. Campbell Brown, NBC News, Washington.
And still ahead tonight from Washington, more on the inauguration, including George W. Bush as you've never seen him before. And up next, members of the Army's 3rd Infantry Division going back for yet another tour of duty in Iraq. While this capital city is celebrating tonight a decidedly different reality for some members of the storied 3rd Infantry Division of the U.S. Army. They're on their way back to Iraq for another tour of duty in the war zone. The company commander and 250 soldiers are on their way back to the region tonight to join the troops already there, to be followed by more who will be deploying in the days to come. In depth tonight, here is NBC's Mike Taibbi.
They're ready.
And up next here tonight, a warning shot that was meant to be much more in a dangerous part of the world. In northern Afghanistan today, a powerful warlord who fought the Taliban alongside U.S. forces survived an apparent assassination attempt. A suicide bomb exploded where General Abdul Rashid Dostum and others gathered to pray. At least 20 people were injured. A spokesman for the ousted Taliban says it carried out the attack to avenge the killing of prisoners during the U.S.-led invasion there. American troops aiding tsunami survivors across Asia will now start scaling back their efforts. That announcement today from the U.S. military, which says it will start transferring relief efforts to host nations and international humanitarian groups. The death toll, by the way, from the disaster now ranges between 158 and 221,000 people. Also today, some of the world's wealthiest nations rallied behind plans for a new system to warn of future killer waves in the Indian Ocean specifically. There is business news tonight. Delta Airlines today reported a $2.2 billion loss in just the fourth quarter of last year. That gave the nation's third largest carrier the airline industry's worst ever annual financial performance, with a total loss now of $5.2 billion. Delta officials blamed high fuel prices, low fares, and hefty charges against earnings for the poor results, which missed even Wall Street's low expectations. Shares of Delta fell nearly 10%. They were down 58 cents to $5.37. A down day overall for the rest of Wall Street this inauguration day. The Dow was down 68.5. NASDAQ was down almost 28 points. We're back with more from Washington right after this.
Tomorrow, exclusive.
We had already given her up at some point.
But this teen survived a week trapped in her car, and we'll ask her how on Today. Looking for a new...
Today may have been this president's second inaugural, but it was hardly just the second time he's attended. In looking through the NBC News archives, the hours and hours of videotape of past inaugurals show George W. Bush as spectator, as son, and future president, a man who's been here before. Inauguration Day 1981, when Ronald Reagan and George Bush came to power. But there was another future president on the stand that day, 34-year-old George W. Bush, with a ringside seat on the day's proceedings. The fact is, George W. Bush has seen the presidency up close since he was a boy. His grandfather, Prescott Bush, sworn into the Senate the same day as John F. Kennedy, was close to Dwight Eisenhower and Richard Nixon.
Press Bush.
Nixon later became a mentor to George Bush Sr.
I want to tell you why I feel so strongly about George Bush.
And throughout Bush Sr.'s political career, George W. was close at hand. At the 1972 Republican convention, other VIPs brought their wives.
Ambassador George Bush.
But UN Ambassador George Bush brought his son, a chance to meet future Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld. At the 1980 convention, Bush introduced his son to Ronald Reagan.
I tell you, as a Texan, I felt proud.
In 1988, George W. was there when his father ran for president, playing a key role behind the scenes.
George Bush.
He was there at the convention, celebrating as his dad captured the nomination. And he was there when his father became president of the United States.
So help me God.
On that inauguration day, George W. Bush was asked about his own political future.
I really haven't figured it out yet. I'm back in Texas, live in Dallas, trying to make a living. No silver foots for this Bush, and I haven't made up my mind.
12 years later, to the day, George W. Bush, presidential understudy, was back at the White House, but this time to move in. Now, of course, he has done what Eisenhower, Nixon, and Reagan did, but his father could not. He's been reelected, and today, once again, he took his place on the inaugural stage.
So help me God.
Congratulations.
Sometimes it's a transfer of power. Today was more like a continuation. George W. Bush was not everyone's choice for president. The protesters made that point clear. But just as clear was the message that this is how this nation operates. The massive security lockdown here is in place because our world has changed. What hasn't changed is how we elect and then celebrate our presidents. And that is what was on display here today. That is Nightly News for this Thursday, Inauguration Day, January 20th, 2005. I'm Brian Williams in Washington tonight. We'll see you tomorrow evening from Los Angeles. Good night. Next, the inaugural address. Can it really happen in today's real world?